I think we'll start. Welcome to our discussion on the second most pressing topic of the times after the pandemic, climate change. There's also something that cannot be solved with just a vaccine, unfortunately. This is the third event in our series on better economics for climate change. So far, we've discussed how neoclassical economics has dealt with climate change and imagined a different curriculum for environmental economics. A little about the organizers. The Rethinking Economics India Network is an organization run by a bunch of passionate individuals who are joined together by their collective urgency to build an ecosystem for pluralist economics in India by connecting universities, civil society, and the private sector. The other organizer is the Pale Project, who focus on research driven solutions for global agendas. They want to connect students and professionals for mutually insightful discussions through youth conferences and events. Today, we are joined by practitioners from organizations at the forefront of climate policy and research in India. We will be discussing climate and green finance, current policy landscape, and the transition to a low carbon economy, and policy and regulatory challenges for the same in India. Our first speaker is Dr. Ratin Roy. He's the managing director of the Overseas Development Institute, senior advisor at the Climate Bonds Initiative, and senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research. He was also the director and CEO of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and has worked as an economic diplomat and policy advisor at the UNDP. Our next speaker is Ms. Ulka Kelkar, Director Climate Program at World Resources Institute. As an economist, she brings 20 years of experience in change research, capacity building, and outreach. Her work in policy aims to support India's pathway to a climate resilient low carbon economy. And our final speaker of the session is Ms. Kanika Chawla, an expert in renewable energy, finance, and market creation. She is the director of the Center of Energy Finance at the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. She manages CEW's work of enabling energy transition in emerging economies. So today's discussion will start with opening remarks from all our speakers. They will all have 15 minutes each, and then they will then have some time to respond to each other or pose questions to each other. This will be followed by the public Q&A session where I will be asking questions posed by the attendees in the Q&A chat. So please add your questions to that Q&A section at the bottom of the screen throughout the session. Also upvote the questions that you want asked, which will make it easier for me to choose them. So without taking more time, I want to invite Dr. Roy to start the discussion with his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Aditi. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you for inviting me to this session. And I'm going to take the title of the session very seriously. I'm going to talk only about economics and how we need to rethink economics in the context of climate change. I'm not therefore going to be talking about India except in passing. I'll really be talking about sort of the economic issues. But I must warn you, when I say economics, I mean political economy, and not just economics as apparently understood. So let me start by asking, what is the economics in climate change? Earth is getting warmer. So what do you want to do about it? The economics in climate change depends at the very initial H naught on how you want to answer this question. Because the question can be answered in two different ways, in my view. One is saying that we need to rewrite production functions so that the same level of output or anticipated output, or even more, can be generated using fewer carbon emitting resources. The other approach, which is much less popular, especially in Europe and the US, is that we need geographies and people with higher incomes to use the luxury of having those higher incomes to reduce their consumption such that this reduced consumption C results in reduced emissions and allows people in geographies and just people with lower incomes to consume more, such that when you solve this equation, and notice it's not a solution of constraint optimization, you have people giving up consumption, you have people consuming more. But the net result here, if you don't change the production function, has to be less global consumption with a shift that implies a dramatic reduction in consumption inequality. That also allows you to meet the whatever emissions target you have. So you can solve this in two ways. You can say what are the various different kinds of consumption switching strategies that the world can adopt, such that you achieve a given target. Or you say, given a socially optimum consumption switching strategy, by how much can emissions be reduced? And then you have to then talk about how you adapt. If that reduction in emissions is not enough to halt global warming, you have to talk about how you adapt to that increase in global warming, which leads to the first set of dynamics, which is, if there is global warming and people have to adapt, then does that mean that we have to again worry about redistribution, or do we have to then go into the production function? So as I see, there are two definite teleological approaches to this problem at the macroeconomic level. And I'm saying this to you because in neoclassical economics, I don't know why you call it neoclassical economics, neoclassical economics is better than that. In contemporary lazy policy economics, the whole question has been subsumed by two things. One, the efficient markets hypothesis, which indicates that money should flow to places where it is most efficiently used. And therefore, if it is efficient to deal with climate change, this is very much the European Union approach, then we need to make sure that markets are able to see that this efficiency occurs and are therefore able to price resource flows such that this efficiency is accounted for. And that is the bulk of economics discussion that takes place, right? And to do this, you may need to change production functions, and to change production functions, you may need to temporarily subsidize certain kinds of technologies so that they grow and prosper and their relative prices become favorable, so that then fossil fuel technologies, for example, become stranded assets, and by becoming stranded assets, they become less efficient to deploy, and therefore the whole world is full of people, vegetarian people, so that agriculture changes and renewable energy using people, right? And therefore your aggregate climate reductions target is achieved. Notice that in this argument, I don't need to bring in redistribution at all. I can frighten you, as they often do, the environmental people, by saying to you that the poor will suffer most from climate change because their habitats will be destroyed. Or Bangladesh is a poor country and is going to get screwed by climate change because वो बहुत पानी है वहाँ, वो पानी उठेगा तो slum पे आ जाएगा, ये सब बोलते हैं ना? There's no economics in that. No, this is just fear mongering. It may be valid fear mongering, but it's fear mongering. There's no economics in it, right? It's a technical proposition which my friend Aruma Devi, who's a scientist type, might make. That scientifically, oceans will rise, land will fall, Bible story padho. There's no economics in it. The consequences of this involve in economics, or the acceptance of this, I prefer to call it geopolitical hypothesis, involves actions. But in the mainstream approach, as I see it, to climate change economics, redistribution or inequality is neither necessary nor sufficient if your superordinate goal is emissions reduction. It may be a positive externality of a strategy you employ for emissions reduction. And I'll take an example there of vegetarian food is good. I know my own organization has stopped serving non-vegetarian food. I don't know why in London. Okay. They said no, vegetarian food is good for climate, non-veg is bad for climate. Okay. But I know that I asked them, I said, see, in India, I have people who eat rats. And people are eating like scorpions and things. You know, some Chinese ate some bats and all sorts of things happen, not to climate. So are you saying they should also stop eating rats? So again, when you make statements like that, it depends on the context within which these statements have to be taken and appreciated. In India, a lot of Dalits eat beef. So I'm saying that Dalits are bad for the climate. Doesn't matter to a climate person. A climate person who is fixed in a Jesuitical way on reducing climate change emissions, and I want to make this very strong point, is actually indifferent except for marketing purpose or something else to the cause of redistribution. So if my only goal was to reach the zero emissions target by whatever date, I can do that without worrying about redistribution. The reason why you might worry about redistribution in this argument is that the objects of your Jesuitical drive may not cooperate with you. If they see this as inimical to their prosperity, which comes in two ways as economists, where they see it, so it's not enough to apply the Pareto rule. The Pareto rule would say if they are no worse off, they're shit poor today, they're shit poor tomorrow, and we have a zero emissions world. But they have been told that tomorrow they will be better off. So if they are no worse off, it's not good enough. So that might be one reason why in this paradigm, you seek to make sure that you achieve your, now it becomes an optimization constraint. That you maximize till zero, your zero emissions pathway, until such time, consistent with the constraint of making sure that there's a certain increase in aggregate welfare over that horizon. And that is very much what developing countries and emerging economies have been told at places like whatever that thing is called Paris and all that sort of, all this COP form. All right. Then, oh, we will make sure that your prosperity within constraints is optimized. Now it is, I put it to you that this is a profoundly neoclassical way of looking at things, because it starts with the assumption, which is very neoclassical, that the demand side does not matter. It starts with the assumption, which is very cleverly masked because it's not polite to say so, but I want to put it to you, that redistribution is orthogonal to climate change. It can be. It can be. You just stop India's GDP growth. In fact, if we have this shrinking of the Indian economy, it's going to be damn good for the climate. So all those coal plants were unoccupied in Q1. Band ho gaye. So theek hai. And then slowly you change the technology. But that change in technology does not automatically mean that you will get better lives or livelihoods or a better income distribution. You could get a worse income distribution depending on who owns those technologies. And there is no movement or collective action to say that, which would be an important thing to do in this context if you believe in redistribution, that an efficient way to do this would be to completely socialize the costs of the energy transition, for example, and thereby assure that redistribution is Pareto efficient. Because if you socialize those costs, then they would be paid essentially by geographies which were richer and not by geographies that were poorer. But you will notice that in the climate debates that occur at the policy level, just like with the pandemic, the market solution is never contested. The idea that private players using climate bonds and impact investing will come and solve your climate problem is a sine qua non of all policy debate on climate, as it is with the pandemic. I know this because of the last 3 months when I've been passionately arguing with the coalition that it makes sense for us to stop all aid and use it all to socialize the vaccines that are coming out. Approximate cost would be $1 trillion. It's not much. Global savings are 7 trillion. That argument is met with sort of polite giggling. So the political economies, we live in a capitalist system. And so what you're going to get is an economics of climate change that is private sector driven. The argument for socializing the public costs of climate change, which is so popular in health, you're not going to see in the climate space from even the most vegetarian liberal in Germany. And that is where I think fundamentally I depart in my last 5 minutes, right? I have 5 minutes. I depart from this entire premise that has driven the economics of climate change discussion in the mainstream across the last 15 years. And this is where I think what textbooks need to do is talk about the other way to look at climate change, speaking as an economist, as a counterfactual, as an analytical framework. So I want someone to answer the question, to what extent would we need to reduce global consumption and therefore, in fact, reduce global growth if without changing technology, ceteris paribus, we had to get climate change? And then I can solve for that by introducing production functions. You get my point as economists? So I'm saying my equation that I write is different. I say when climate change is a function of global consumption of whatever sort, right? I can define it later. So negative delta C should bring you to an emissions target up to a point, and you'll come to a C naught today minus delta C, negative delta C down. That means delta Y will also go down. Then I start solving for technologies to reduce that delta C necessary. Then I start solving for whose consumption, right? And I do this by arguing that the amount of discretionary consumption that people do when they are rich is greater than that when they do when they are poor. So I add that equation into the model, or that analytical construct. Doesn't have to be an equation, right? So I turn the climate change economics argument on its head and make it an argument about how much we consume and who consumes. So then moderated by technological change. That I think is what a developing or emerging economy should do. That is what I think would be genuinely a climate change argument in favor of people in low-income geographies. To give you a very vivid picture, I'm sure Kanika has heard this. I said it in Paris, I've said it everywhere. I want to see people in Sweden wearing overcoats and putting off their central heating, and I don't care whether their energy is renewable or comes from methane gas or whatever, or wind or God or whatever. I don't care. I want to see you wearing overcoats so that I can get energy from whatever source in this country for a child to open a light bulb to read, whether it comes from coal or whatever. I then want to see the budgeting of consumption, and then we can start solving by positive sum game solutions. But the baseline economic framework that I want should be based on global reduction in consumption, tempered by supply side improvements and production function improvements. And why am I saying that? Because the baseline you're giving me using the theory of efficient markets is a private sector driven, production function altering, consumption indifferent, and therefore, except for the political economy, redistribution indifferent deal. So climate change economics, if it is to be part of the larger economic problem we have today, which is not how to maximize prosperity, but how to maximize prosperity in a way that people are able to participate in the production of prosperity and thereby create conditions for productive inclusion and therefore inclusive prosperity. That's the big debate going on today. COVID has made it very apparent. Not that 10 people make a lot of money, we tax them and we redistribute the rest of the money to 90 people who have no stake in the economy. No, right? That's what we are saying when we challenge neoliberalism today. So I will transpose that to climate change and make the argument that what is urgently needed now is a less autistic, less neoclassical, less market driven, less production function focused, less supply side driven, which is very convenient for capitalism, and therefore less Jesuitical in that sort economic framework within which to assess climate change, in favor of a consumption function driven, a demand side driven approach to what it would take to achieve zero emissions, with the supply side then alleviating the magnitude of sacrifice that people will have to make, which allows me to then ask who is making those sacrifices in this alternate paradigm. I want to end by saying that oddly enough, this was the paradigm that environment people talked about in the 80s and 90s. This was actually the paradigm in which a foremost neoclassical economist, David Pearce, used to speak in the old days. When he talked about shadow pricing, he had to bring in equity. Brundtland brought in equity. And Brundtland and people brought in equity because when they talked about common planetary boundaries, they actually talked about the need to change the way we are growing, consistent with an equalization of prosperity such that planetary boundaries were not in any way inflected. But the climate change economics discussion from Paris, up to Paris and even beyond today, has gone way away from that. And it is therefore fundamentally a discussion rooted in orthodoxy, a belief in efficient markets, and a belief that the central problem is one of allocating finance to private sector players with some subsidies, etc. And I think we need to move away from that. So I would say in conclusion that rethinking economics in the context of climate change involves rethinking the supply side production function approach and moving towards an approach where we ask the fundamental question in terms of how much consumption do we need to reduce and what can we do to make sure that that reduction is as little as possible and hurts people who are at the vulnerable end of the scale as little as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. That was a great start, right on time. We'll go to the next speaker, Ulka Kilkar.
Thanks, Aditi. Tough act to follow, right? So
Yeah.
I'm going to hide behind slides and let me share my screen. Just let me know when you're able to see it in full screen mode. Yeah, great. So, you had posed two questions to us, when you invited us to speak. One was around finance, one was around the policy landscape. So I think just like as Ratin did, I'm going to very quickly address those two questions and then move on to what I want to say anyway, right? So on the finance side, I think Kanika is really best placed to discuss some of the emerging trends, but very briefly, what we are seeing on finance for climate change, for green technologies, is that it's mostly private rather than public. It's mostly domestic rather than any international finance coming in. It's mostly loans rather than grants. And it's mostly coming in for the power sector rather than for things like transport or infrastructure. But if you look at finance from the perspective of an individual household or a family, and if you see the potential there is for installing, say, a rooftop solar photovoltaic system on your rooftop, the amount of upfront capital that is required is so high that it would be very difficult for an ordinary family to actually benefit from this potential. So what we need in renewable energy is sometimes very simple but different business models. Like, for example, we don't pay for our entire Netflix usage over our lifetimes upfront. We pay for it every month as a subscription. Similarly, we need things like a pay-as-you-go model in renewable energy as well. You could have your rooftop solar loan bundled into your home loan, because that is when often households, when they're building a new house, they start thinking of this. And think of it also from the perspective of, say, a small hospital. This picture is taken from Jharkhand. And when the coronavirus pandemic was going on, they had to spend 3 to 4 lakhs on diesel to run their ventilators. Electricity, well, they are connected to the grid, but electricity is not reliable. So instead, they could actually go in for solar, which the cost is something like 50 lakhs, that's something that could be supported through various means of climate finance. But you need a business model where the entire cost doesn't fall on the household or the hospital. But in general, I would say that all finance matters, because otherwise, if you look at what's happening with fossil fuel subsidies, it's almost like taking away with one hand what you're giving with the other. And one important data point to look at is what's happening in these COVID economic recovery packages. What are governments spending their money on for the economic stimulus? And if you see in the energy sector, for every $3 of money that is going to fossil fuel-based energy, $2 is going for clean energy. So there is some hope, but it's not all great. You can use, this is a really nice searchable database. You can look at every kind of measure that every country around the world is announcing. Let me just pause here and talk a little bit about the current policy landscape in India. And one whole stream of policies is the kind that Ratin spoke about, which takes its legitimacy from the United Nations process, Paris Agreement, all of that, led by the MOEFCC, right? Those commitments that India makes internationally. That's one thing. But the other whole set of policies that is happening is domestic led. It has nothing to do with climate change. It is because of reasons of energy security. It is because of reasons of air pollution. So for example, the Central Electricity Authority's optimum energy generation mix of 450 megawatts by 2030, that's something that we had not initially announced in the Paris Agreement or in our nationally determined contribution, but something that makes sense for India in any case. Similarly, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs had the Smart Cities mission. And over the years, it has evolved into a climate smart cities mission. Not perfect by any means, but there is a recognition that you need to do more than have this layer of IoT on top of urban infrastructure. But if your cities don't give some recognition to environmental resilience, sort of the additional layer of smart cities will be meaningless. I'm sure Kanika will be speaking about solar and EV, so I won't go there. But the main point over here is this: the kind of economics that Ratin spoke about. Here, the one number which captures the benefits of any action to future generations is this discount rate, right? And the higher the discount rate, the less you care about your children or grandchildren, right? About the future. But the future, unfortunately, is coming awfully close. When we talk about the Earth as a whole stabilizing at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, well, my children will hopefully be alive in 2100. So this is something that kind of lies behind the kinds of questions that you're asking, which is that, yes, in some cases, we need to think of a better kind of economics. And in other cases, we just need to do our regular economics better. So I'll give some examples in the next few slides. And but there are some sort of references at the bottom of my slides, which I would encourage the participants to go and have a look at. There's a blog post called The Economic Case for Greta Thunberg, where he argues that a young person talking about climate change is the discount rate personified. So to have a look at that. But we tried to kind of, use this thinking and come up with with an analysis, just an illustrative analysis for India of what would be the economic rate of return rather than the internal rate of return. So an internal rate of return is the kind of metric that all business people use, comparing costs with financial returns. But what about the social costs, right? What about the impacts on people's health, on water consumption, on land diversion, right? Can you also put that in a comparable metric? And this paper tries to do that, and you find that solar PV, for example, has performs much better than the normal baseline of coal. Rooftop solar, though it's actually great in terms of land, it doesn't need land, but the kind of economies of scale that a ground-mounted solar project will get is sort of outweighs the benefits. And we're doing this analysis specifically for 3 states, so we'll be happy to share those findings. But the reason why we did it this way was that you get a simple number that a businessman or that a policymaker could compare with the social discount rate or with the internal rate of return, and sort of see where do you need policy support. I'll move away from this to a different approach, which is that of multi-criteria analysis. When you can't do cost-benefit analysis in the sense that you cannot sometimes monetize or even quantify certain costs or benefits. What if you went to the community directly and asked them which of these possible, say in this case, adaptation options do you think are the most important? And you give them some criteria and sort of ask them to weigh them and to and this is an exercise that I was involved in a few years ago in a drought-prone district in Marathwada called Jalna. And we did this for different groups of people. The chart on the left talks about what landed farmers, male farmers, thought were the most important options. They wanted everything, of course. And the chart on the right is, when we went to women and asked them, most of them often did not even know what many of those options meant. And that's why the chart is looking so blank, right? It's very hard to do things like comparing options on 2 different criteria, just 2 different criteria. The reason why I put this chart here is that if you don't ask the people, whose lives will get impacted by mitigation or adaptation measures, then things are not going to work out the way you think they will. So when we propose resilience measures or adaptation measures, how will that affect women's work burden? If it involves new skills, will they have access to those training programs? Will they be able to go there or not? And there are similar issues with, for example, LPG refills. And there is anthropological research that shows that the landscape matters. Do you have access to biomass? Power relations matter. Whether this scheme is implemented in Himachal Pradesh or in a drought-prone district in northern Karnataka, the results are different. So I think economics needs to, there are methodologies that are being used, but we need to sort of go deeper. The other sort of type of uncertainty that economics is struggling with is technological change and being able to predict innovation, right? The speed of innovation. And this is a chart which the International Energy Agency puts out every year, the prediction of how it thinks renewable energy is going to grow. And the reality, which is shown by the solid black line, far outpaces any of those projections. Why did this happen? There are many, many different reasons. But the point is that, we are perhaps seeing similar trends with battery prices, or even with what is now being called as green hydrogen, which is hydrogen that is produced by renewable electricity. So there are types of economic complexity, economics, trying to model innovation and so on. I don't yet do it, but that's something I wanted to highlight. The most sort of exciting work that we do at WRI India is trying to take a systems dynamics approach. That is, what happens in one sector also affects what's happening in other sectors. And can we have an energy economy model that looks at all of these changes together? And if you have an intervention in one sector, how does it play out in other sectors? So if you look at, very simply, at which sectors are growing, right, for the next 30 years, from today, 2020 to 2050, most of these sectors where the CO2 emissions are going to come from are this is only looking at industry, by the way, this is not looking at all the sectors, but these are also the industries that are building our cities, that are building our infrastructure, that are creating jobs, and that are fueling GDP growth. So, so could you have interventions in these sectors? What would be the impact on jobs? Who would make the sacrifices, as Natin said in his opening remarks? But if we do a scenario, which I'm not showing over here, of how India would meet its sustainable development goals, that is all that it wants to achieve in terms of clean water, good health, all of that, right? And also climate change, reduce emissions. The greatest potential is in moderating the material efficiency used in sectors like cement and iron and steel. So how do you nudge these sectors into a path of greater efficiency? How do you bring in, for example, circular economy thinking, where the waste of one industry hopefully becomes the raw material of another industry? And here I want to talk about a particular policy instrument called putting a price on carbon. This could be in the form of a carbon tax, but there could be other things. For example, there are companies like Infosys, which already have an internal, completely voluntary price on carbon, right? And this graph shows you what would be the CO2 emissions that would be saved as a result of putting a carbon price of 2,000 rupees per ton of CO2 in electricity and on industry. And this slide shows you what would be the health impact, right? So that is something that I think we need to remember, that when we speak about things in terms of climate change or carbon, we distance ourselves from the real impacts on society. This is also dirty air that people are breathing, right? This is lives that have been shortened as a result of our choices in power and industry. So that's something. But a price on carbon that may be imposed in the form of a tax means revenue, right? And the revenue means somebody is having to pay. Often these prices, these taxes will get passed on to end consumers, and the revenue needs to be recycled back to families who are the most vulnerable, or even to industries in order to encourage them to innovate, to invest in R&D. So I'm going to just end with, I think, one or two very last slides, which is really the emerging discussion in the climate change field, which is, we're talking about all these transitions, low carbon transition, but how do we make sure that this low carbon transition is fair and equitable? How do we make sure that it's a just transition? When we talk about early retirement of coal power plants, whose jobs are lost, and when we talk about new green jobs coming in, who are the people who will get those new green jobs? You bring in migrant laborers to construct a solar park, whereas the pastoralists who depended on the land for grazing may no longer have access to that land. So there are issues over here of reskilling, of finance. Again, there is a gender impact. That is, will women have access to that finance? Will they have access to those training programs? There are countries like Spain which have come up with an idea of a just transition fund, where money is given to the people to coal miners, basically, to set up new businesses. But I think India needs to think of many more kinds of things. I'm going to end with work that is done not by my organization, but by researchers from the Just Jobs Network. And what they've tried to do is look at the current quality of jobs, right? So not just the quantity, but what's the level of formal contracts or pensions and other benefits? Or are there unions, for example, for those industries? What's the ratio of formal to informal wages or male to female wages or employment rate? And they've come up with a Just Jobs state level index for India. And they find two things. One is the states that perform the best on GDP are not necessarily the states which have the best jobs, and best is relatively speaking, but they're not the ones with the good quality jobs. And even within the states, I mean, in this case, you can see Andhra Pradesh and Maharashtra highlighted. Even in these states, there are, it's important to see specific drivers. So in Tamil Nadu, for example, there are more formal jobs, but the benefits, the access to benefits is not great. So I'm going to end with this slide, which is to kind of say, yes, we need to look at all the various metrics that we look at in conventional economics, use some different approaches, borrow them from other disciplines, even think about transdisciplinary research where the affected communities are involved at the problem identification stage itself, and then try to feed it into policy using the language of economists and policymakers. So let me just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alka. That was really clear and right on time. And I would like to encourage our attendees to ask as many questions as they can. I'll be asking them after Kanika's presentation. I see there are some already good questions for Ratan, so if that could happen for Olga too. Okay, moving on to the next speaker, Ms. Kanika Chawla.
Thank you, Aditi. Many thanks to Rethinking and Bale for inviting me to speak alongside the very prolific Ratan and Ulka. And I think that they've kind of set the stage really very nicely. I think Ulka really nicely opened the discussion up to beyond just the economics and to other aspects of the energy transition, of climate change as well. But I want to pull back a little bit to focus on the finance question as well. If Ratan focused on the rethinking economics part, I'll focus on the policy implications part of the session title to kind of tie it all up together. So I'm going to talk about three things today. One, what is climate finance? Two, how should we use it? And then finally, what is better economics? Or as Ulka said, how can you do regular economics better? And then I want to respond, Aditi, to something you said upfront about COVID. And then I definitely want to come back on some of the things that Ratan said around consumption functions and to, as always, disagree with him on that. So I'll start with kind of, what is climate finance? And I think that it's important to kind of think about where climate finance, or at least the common usage of the phrase climate finance, comes from. And it's actually not from economics. But it is very much from climate negotiations, right? And that's kind of where it's enshrined. It's enshrined in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's one of the tracks on which climate negotiations happen. And that's also why it becomes more than a finance and economics issue, purely a political issue, which is kind of why also the center that I run, called the Center for Energy Finance, is not called the Center for Climate Finance, because we actually want to talk about the nuts and bolts of work rather than actually think just about negotiation strategy. But the negotiation strategy is important to think about how the economics of climate finance is taught, which is kind of where Ratan started today's discussion, right? So climate finance so maybe even a step before that. So the Framework Convention on Climate Change recognizes that different countries have had a different role to play in the current climate change scenario that we are in. And actually it enshrines within it this principle of equity, which Ratan also talked about upfront. And as a result, to kind of level the playing field, create carbon space, all the things that I'm sure Tejal also talked about in your previous session that you guys had hosted. It's almost like this is punitive money that developed countries must make available to aid the process of climate action in developing countries, right? So in a way, it does exactly what Rathin was saying, where it tries to even the playing field. What is actually happening, the policy implication of this is that countries agreed in Copenhagen that they would facilitate the flow of $100 billion annually from the developed world to the developing countries through the GCF, right? What is actually happening is that this $100 billion is not there. According to OECD estimates, there is between 40 and $60 billion. According to Ministry of Finance of the Government of India estimates, there is $2 billion. And the reason for this is because of the accounting of climate finance. Interestingly, the FCCC or even the Paris Agreement actually says all climate finance must be new and additional. You cannot just say your existing overseas development assistance that was being provided is now suddenly, go build some solar plants, put a wind turbine somewhere, and that suddenly becomes climate finance, right? And that is where the accounting difference comes. The other place where the accounting differentiation comes in is that it is public money as well as private money induced by public action. What is private money induced by public action has not been defined, and it is actually very difficult to define, right? In a way, all private spending is induced by public action because the public, or so to speak, the governments allow those products to be sold, right? So if you really wanted to say, you could say all consumption in the world is induced by public action. So then in accounting terms, it becomes very interesting and also debatable. So that then begs the question of where does India stand in all this? Because I'm assuming that most of the participants today are from India. So India is a great champion for climate finance and to uphold the principle of this equity and common but differentiated responsibility in climate change negotiations, and argues that this money must become available. Now, as a matter of principle, which is also kind of the way that Rathin was saying that the economics of it should be structured, etc., this is a very good point to uphold, or a good principle to uphold. But let's also kind of just think in terms of, again, policy implications. If this $100 billion was made available, okay, let's assume that it happens. So our fight, the good fight that we are fighting, yields results. And if all of this $100 billion came only to India, even then that money would be inadequate for India's climate action. And India's climate action required in domestic interest, not to just realize some kind of global commitments that India has made. Now, this goes back to the point that Rathin said, that there is no economics in framing that, oh, but Bangladesh is going to be underwater. Absolutely right. It's a statement of fact nonetheless, right? And your action must respond to circumstance. So for instance, in any kind of trade-off that economics will set up, it does respond to some circumstance, and this is just the circumstance that we are in. Even though the kind of conditions around it may not be economic, so to speak. So then that begs the question that this is kind of why we then try and take this market-based approach, because that then seems to be the only one where, sorry, I thought I had lost the internet, but I didn't, sorry. No, that seems to be the only one where you can actually mobilize the amount of capital required at scale to realize the ambition or the targets or the action that is absolutely necessary, right? So then that makes me go to the second question of, if you do have green finance, how do you use it? Or really in a question of what are the different categories under which this green finance comes in, and then how is it spent? So the first way that it comes in is through these multilateral and bilateral channels, which we were discussing just now. But there's a lot of public money that is also spent. So for instance, when you build a dam, or when you build any kind of, say, advanced warning system for natural disasters, is that adaptation spending, which is then would make it green capital or climate finance, or is that infrastructure development? And the thing is, this kind of green tagging mechanism, especially in the Indian context, but in most parts of the world, is not well developed. because a lot of what needs to happen serves twin purposes. So for instance, if you want to strengthen your grid infrastructure for transmission of electricity, is that something that you should do anyway? Because, a couple of years ago, most of you would recall, we had this big grid failure, which had nothing to do with renewables. We didn't have any significant share of renewables in the grid system at the time. So you actually need transmission upgrades regardless. But now when we have a lot more renewables, there is one school of thought that suggests that requires or it has accelerated the pace at which we need these transmission upgrades, and therefore this is the burden of renewables themselves. So I think that it's important to kind of firstly develop a correct or at least an acceptable methodology to qualify as what is climate finance, what is green spending domestically, which does not currently exist. And finally is private green spending, right? And this is where a lot of my work is in this space of around mobilizing private green spending. And one of the things that I take great objection to is where a lot of people suggest that the rules of the game for private green spending should be different from the rules of the game for private spending writ large. And that I don't understand why that is the case. Of course, if you think about, overall, you can suggest that the current system of private financing or, just generally capitalism is bad, etc. Yes, I don't disagree. And those are great conversations to have, especially as a part of rethinking economics. But I don't think that should be the burden for green finance to bear. Once you've sorted out and developed a kind of economic order that is better than capitalism or more functional. I mean, better, many things are better, but more functional than capitalism and as widely accepted as capitalism, then green will also adopt that. But it cannot be the burden of green to develop this new financial order or new economic order. So I think that within that is also kind of why these market-based approaches are the most acceptable. But we can debate that later. Ratin, I see you itching to take a go at me. But finally, I want to talk a little bit about how do you spend this green money, right? There's a lot of focus on raising green money, whether you raise it in the form of grants, whether you raise it in the form of loans, whether you raise it in the form of equity, but very few people know what to do with it. So I have all this green money and now I do not know what to do with it, right? Of course, the easiest way to spend it is on renewables. And I would encourage anybody who has money to spend to actually spend it on renewables. But regardless of that, I think it's important to think about, and I'm going to loop a little bit back to what Ratin was saying around demand side as well, right? And this is the demand for green capital. And we often don't know how to deploy this capital. And it is about consumption choices, but we don't know what to consume. And this is where it is not so much about new consumption, but existing opportunities for green consumption that already exist, right? And within that, the trade-offs are often incorrectly defined. So for instance, as the joke for economists goes, the answer to everything is it depends. But that's often because we've always set up a trade-off. And my argument for better economics or doing, original or existing economics better is to think about why did we set up these false trade-offs or kind of what are almost red herrings of sorts, right? Where we say coal versus renewables. If that is the trade-off, the market has shifted to renewables. And it is no longer the burden of one. For instance, when there was synthetic material that was developed, the entire jute industry of India and Bangladesh was wiped out. But synthetic materials did not have to bear the burden of all the jute workers that lost their jobs, etc. This concept of just transitions and all of these other aspects, which to me are truly critical, but purely from an economic standpoint, the burden becomes that of the new sector to bear because the new sector or because the incumbent sector has so much public money invested in it. And that is, I think, the problem in how, so either you can have economics or you can have politics, the balancing act. You cannot actually say your balancing act is based on economics. And at the moment, we are kind of conflating these two issues. So I want to talk about a few things around economics and about how to deploy. So one is on the learning curves of finance, right? So whenever we think about climate change, we think about disruptive technology. And while disruptive technology will be critical, disruptive finance is something we don't think about enough. The reason that finance continues to go into incumbent sectors is because there's a familiarity with incumbent sectors. And just like technology gets cheaper over time, the biggest driver, or one of the biggest drivers of technology getting cheaper over time, is because technology can now access the same capital at cheaper and cheaper prices. So for instance, analysis that we have done at CEW suggests that in emerging economies, as much as 2/3 of the cost of a single renewable energy electron is the cost of debt and servicing debt and returns on equity. So your technology price is actually already asymptotic to zero. So any change in making consumption of certain commodities like renewable energy more attractive and doing this demand-driven transition or demand-driven climate action will come from advancing the learning curves of capital. And the second one is also related, is around market scale, right? So as this is economics 101, you know this, if you know things that are done at scale become cheaper there, and there is again a learning curve around it. And so that also is another important aspect to why or how finance is consumed and how the demand for finance is driven. And so then that leads to the point around economics, or what do we mean by better economics, right? Where current climate change today, in my opinion, is actually a market failure. And it is a market failure because perhaps we didn't have all the information or whatever else, or the market didn't keep pace with the information, deniers, et cetera, et cetera. We can go, that's a whole different debate in and of itself. And as you, I think, wrote in your background note for this, the tragedy of commons, right? Ratin was talking before we started about the clean air we have today. It is a tragedy of commons that we think that just because we can isolate ourselves in air purified bubbles, and this is also true for water and other things, that it's fine for me to drive a diesel car. And it is really very simple basic consumption trade-offs like that. And while those basic consumption trade-offs, even if you added all of them up, and like vegetarianism, something Ratin brought up, Ulka brought up a bunch of different things around how we consume and how we pay for commodities, together also they are inadequate to fight the overall challenge. But just in terms of, if you were to think about at a microeconomic level, this is kind of how the consumption trade-offs are being played. It is in fact a tragedy of commons. But it is also true that a lot of what we are calling climate action, a lot of what we think should be subsidized, etc., is free at the margin. And therefore, you should do it because it's cheap. You should do it because it's good economics. Today, for instance, if the government of India, or the government of most countries for that matter, continues to prop up, say, the thermal power sector, that is bad economics, because that is a sector that is already circling the drain. The economics of it do not work. You are in fact putting public sector banks around the country that hold the savings of every single citizen of this country at risk, rather than buying something that is free at the margin. And that for which the economics are supremely compelling, right? But that we don't do it is because we are not following economics, and we are following some other policy and other compulsions, which are not wrong, but it is just to state that they are not pure play economics. And then the last point I wanted to say was on something, Aditi, you said at the start around climate change being the second most compelling challenge after COVID, right? I don't actually think it's the second most, and I don't think it's also entirely separate. But but again, that is a separate debate for another day. But what it does is that COVID has opened up the door for us on climate action in many ways. It's an opportunity to pivot. And I'm going to just talk about a few different ways and how it does that. One is the lessons in communication and kind of just comprehending the enormity of the situation, right? Understanding epidemiology is not simple, at least not for me. Yet all of us, in the face of an existential threat, have become half doctors. And understand R factors and what is the how many jabs of which virus vaccine we need, at what potency, etc. We all seem to have understood that, because it's in the face of existential threat. Climate change is also an existential threat, and a related existential threat. There'll be many more existential threats if you don't take climate action, right? If you're able to price that, the economics of everything turns around. But we just don't communicate that effectively, and we don't generate the kind of evidence that we need to be able to make that compelling argument. The second opportunity is on finance itself. And this is not green finance, but all finance. What COVID has done is actually, whether you are, BlackRock, Bank of America, State Bank of India, or a microfinance entity based in Jharkhand, COVID has affected everybody. And everyone is rethinking how they were pricing risk. And actually, at the end of the day, mobilizing finance is entirely a study in risk return, right? And so this actually opens up the opportunity to advance the conversation around thinking about climate risk, pricing climate risk. It is not enough to say that you need to finance more renewables, or you need to finance electric vehicles, or battery storage. It is really that if you will continue, if you do not decarbonize your portfolio, and this is actually for everyone, even if you invest in mutual funds or whatever else, if you do not decarbonize your portfolio, you are going to lose money. It's very simple. If the State Bank of India gives money to a coal power plant, as it intends to, or in this case, a coal mine, eventually, because of policy, because of climate action, because of economics, because of price discovery, for whatever reason, eventually we will start using less and less and less amount of thermal power plant, thermal power generation. As a result of that, the amount of money or the returns that these banks will make will be lower. People who have been buying sovereign railway, say, paper or bond issuances, which are sovereign rated in India, eventually the railways will stop being able to generate dividends and be able to honor its debt if it does not have all that coal to move around this country. It's a ripple effect. Climate change is going to take out all sorts of industry that are built in coastal towns. This is not fear mongering. This is the truth. It is fear mongering, perhaps in terms of setting up the economic trade-off. But scientifically, this is valid, right? So the economics must respond to also other non-economic discipline truths. And that is where I wanted to also just come to the final point on responding to Ratin, where he said it is about how much we consume and who consumes. Whereas I'd like to say, yes, I don't disagree with that, but it is also about what we consume. And it depends very much on if you're consuming the right thing, so to speak, from my point of view, or climate compliant consumption, that there is actually no limit on how much of that you are. There is some limit, but but there isn't. I feel like the way that equation then sits is very different. And also then on demand-driven transitions, absolutely agree with him, but it's important to then think about what drives demand. And I think that prices just drive demand creation. And so that's why a lot of the points that I was making earlier around learning curves of capital remain relevant. Stop there.
Thank you for that great follow-up to all the presentations. We have 5 minutes to answer, have any follow-up remarks from all the speakers or questions to each other. Ratin, you might have some.
No, I have 2 points to make. One is, of course, I normally do policy economics, so I didn't do that today. But what I want to say very clearly is this, that this is a great setup. So first we say that we have this common planet. Suddenly Swedish children, Indian children are the same. They weren't. Okay, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Now they're shitting because of Arctic and all that. So what I'd like to ask is that now we have this common planet. Now you're saying we have this common planet, but the market system is going to continue as it is. Despite the fact that we have this common planet, all these frightening things are going to happen. I think it is the job of economists to reject that. And the way you do it is by writing a model which shows, I come back to this point, what global consumption reduction would you need to be able to achieve a given climate target? Look, it doesn't matter how, and keep technology constant. Then you start solving for better technology and all that, right? So then I don't need finance. I just need to reduce consumption and reduce total growth. And then you take some social welfare choices. You get what I'm saying? The thing is, nobody's going to fund this work. Because everyone wants you to accept a public interest cause called climate, but then follow market-based solutions, right? That disastrous GEF proves it to you. Okay, nobody is interested in public funding of climate any more than interested in public funding of vaccines. So there I agree with Kanika. Now she's in that space. She wants a green future. But I may have a different view. I may say that I think society should bear its costs. If they want this common future and Arctic and Swedish children are the same as Indian children, I'd like to see some action on Indian children and not just infra-marginal action. Otherwise, let's just what are the costs to India if the Arctic melts? We have to ask these uncomfortable questions because people are refusing to take the alternative approach and are therefore straitjacketing us, just as they did with the theory of efficient markets into adopting, just as it did with globalization, by pointing to some kind of desired global public good, but by saying that the instrumentality that you will use will be exactly what it was yesterday. Whether it's climate finance, whether it is supply demand, whether it is, well, market so hona hi hai, main kya kar sakta, kuch kar nahi sakta. Sorry, I think as an economist, not as a climate professional, not even as a policy person, as an economist, I think our project should be to rethink this and to actually put forth a model that starts by saying the solution to climate change could be a 30% fall in global GDP on average. So what will that mean? And then work up from that to how you want to achieve lower falls in GDP so as to attain some climate target or recalibrate your climate target. That discourse has been completely killed by the climate people who have actually, I think, collaborated in ignoring this political economy of why we are constantly focusing on the supply side. You have to understand, by saying renewables, what Germany is saying is that I will sit in shorts in minus 20 degrees in my room because I can do that with renewables. You are not entitled to a light bulb if it is financed by coal. You can only get over this argument theoretically and analytically if you come up with a consumption budget, global consumption budget approach. And that was consciously abandoned across my lifetime by the climate people as the whole conversation became very posh and mainstream. It went to things like vegetarianism. So that was my larger point. On the policy point, I want to make 2 points. So that's why I think consumption tarika is very important, because what we are doing by ignoring it is basking. So before asking what we consume, I want to ask who consumes less. Then we'll come to what we consume. On the policy question, I must warn that these are not very easy. This carbon tax business, I'm often worried. Let me tell you, as a public finance guy, that's what I do for policy. So I impose a carbon tax, assume I'm very successful. Assume the carbon tax gives me 3% of GDP. Same problem with state taxes, by the way. So now if the carbon tax gives me 3% of GDP and then carbon emissions reduce, then my tax revenue will reduce. Who's going to replace that tax revenue? Because I spend my tax revenue when I get it. No, I don't use it to replace borrowing. This algorithm people have not thought about. And the only way you can solve this algorithm is if the carbon tax is used to finance global public goods. But then you have to have a global tax, and then you go to that stupid airline proposal, because you can't collect taxes globally because taxes are a function of Westphalia. So frankly, I think this carbon taxation, and I think, Alka was right. He said that carbon taxation will be one form of carbon pricing. It doesn't really work for these very practical reasons. They're going to be practical, right? The other thing I want to say about practicality is that if you invest in something where you anticipate that the marginal cost of output, such as renewables, is going to be zero going forward 7 years, then it doesn't make sense to invest in it now. You have to wait for 7 years. I have yet to see an analytical argument other than a rhetorical one or a Jesuitical one that suddenly starts talking about Swedish babies that overcomes this. And I really think as economists, it's our job. I have some ideas on this. But for that, you have to abandon the principle of zero marginal cost pricing. Again, you have to abandon neoclassical economics, because if I follow your neoclassical rules, I will not put a penny into renewables because I know that the prices are going to be lower going forward. Why should I put? So then what they do is they conflate sociology, and I'm speaking as an economist here, but they don't want to reject the notion of marginal cost pricing, because remember, all renewables are produced by profit-making industry. All renewables are produced by profit-making industry. All finance that goes into renewables makes money for those who invest in it. Therefore, marginal cost pricing is not going away there. But when I make this argument that it's bad economics, if what you're saying is true, I'm told, think about the babies. So you see I'll just conclude with that. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with anybody, but you have to understand as economists, and this is what I want to convey to you, that this is the same old battle happening. The same old battle is happening in climate as happened with globalization. People are coming and telling you that there is something called the public good, but we are not going to change the rules of the game or the metrics except at the margin. We are going to talk about just transitions. We're not going to talk about global justice. We are only going to talk about justice in the context of transitions. We're not going to join the global justice argument and take just transitions as part of it. So this is where I think as economists who are rethinking, for the reasons we must exercise extreme caution and evaluate what people are saying when they appeal to us that something makes good sense. Because the frameworks, just as always, are being mixed up time and again in the case of the climate debate as well.
Right. Are there any follow-ups? Maybe Olka, would you like to say something?
I mean, Ratin is trying to sort of provoke sort of a deeper discussion than, than maybe the sort of specific framing of this particular discussion sort of set out to do. I think it's wonderful that, we have people like him speaking the language of justice. I think sometimes when others do it, we are not taken that seriously. If he sort of uses that language, I think there is some hope. I wanted to talk about two things. I mean, this is not a response to any specific question, but, broadly thoughts that came in my mind, because we had a lot of discussion around consumption and behavioral change. There are two sort of phenomena that kind of, that can be observed in our country. One is that, behavioral economics and, influencing behavioral change is never as neat as it appears, obviously, in the textbooks and in the papers from other countries, from the developed countries. For example, there was a study that I was doing in a small town called Ramnagara. This is, in the sort of highway between Bangalore and Mysore. This is, the hub of the silk reading industry. And interestingly, if you look at the houses over there, the lower floor of the house will stack coconut husks to be used as biomass in the hot water boiler. And on the rooftop of the house, there'll be a solar water heating system. And what they've done is completely bypassed the electric geysers that we have in our houses, right? They've gone, but it's also stacking of fuel, both coexist. So the kind of neat behavioral changes that we want to see or that we think we will see don't always happen in a country like ours. It's the same with cooking fuel as well. The second point I wanted to make was sometimes when we look very sort of in a tunnel vision way at behavioral change and consumption, we miss things that are hiding in plain sight. For example, recently there was a big sort of popular article in The Guardian about a research study that was done on super, I think, frequent flyers, the super elite who fly and cause most of the emissions. So like 1% or whatever the flyers cause a lot of the emissions. But if you look at how this frequent flyer is defined, it's one short haul flight in a month. That's what we do for work. Also, it shows that even in developed countries, more than half the population has not taken a flight in the the year before the pandemic started. If you look at India's emissions and the projections going forward, the bulk of transport emissions are not coming from planes. They're not coming from cars, even going forward, however rich we may become. They're coming from freight trucks. And that's because we stopped using the railways for transporting goods the way we used to do just around independence and after, and are using diesel trucks. So sometimes the solutions are hiding in plain sight. They are win-win solutions, much as we may hate to use that word. And sometimes, yes, they make complete economic sense. So that was one sort of point that I really wanted to make. The other issue, because we were talking very loosely about Bangladesh and all of that, is that the reason we can get away with saying such things is because we don't have formal insurance. In other countries, where all assets and people are insured, an extreme event is immediately translated into millions of dollars of losses. But with climate change, the problem that is going to arise is because it is not one state or one district that's going to be hit by a drought or the flood or the cyclone, but sometimes the entire region. The premiums will go up. The cost of the insurance will go up. You'll need aid or the World Bank or others to step in. It quickly becomes a bigger problem than it is at present. So let me just stop there. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Olga. If there is any follow-up responses from Kanika, then we can do that, or else we can just move to Q&A.
I think we can quickly move to Q&A. I just had one point to offer. I think in response, I think that we're having this conversation today at two levels. One is at the kind of principle level, right? Which is where a lot of what Ratin is saying is really important. And I don't disagree with it at that level. But I feel like, and that's kind of, it's really good because he caveated himself upfront by saying, I'm going to speak purely as an economist. Whereas I'm speaking as a public policy professional. And I think that is the kind of delta between where he's at and where I'm at. right? As a student of economics, I don't disagree with anything you say. But I just feel like I'd like to compel everyone who's listening today to kind of say, yes, okay, those are really interesting mind exercises, and eventually we should all endeavor to shift the needle towards a more just economic setup and understanding of these complex issues, but in a purely kind of how the market works, and now he's put the entire market in question, so I'm going to try and think of a different way to phrase this. But I think that just for instance, say we already have shadow carbon pricing in India, right? We have a coal cess or a cess on coal, and then we also have energy efficiency certificates, and there is an energy efficiency certificates market. There's also a renewable energy certificates market, and those are all actually they all operate basically on the same principle of a shadow carbon price. And initially, actually, the coal cess was the way it was designed, then eventually then became for all environmental purpose. But initially, it was for only renewable energy and to advance renewable energy. But the government never used it to that end. They used it to balance their books. So we need to actually put in interventions that then, also hold some of the original thinking to account, I'd say in this case. But I think that there is a way to kind of have within the borders of a country, you could put a carbon price, but then there is some kind of benchmarking to a global carbon price that is adjusted for equity and then spent in country as well as with inflows from other parts of the world to further kind of, build on that principle of equity. And then on the last thing I'd say is on this point around, if renewables is going to eventually become free, we should stop buying it now. It won't become free if we stop buying it now. That's kind of the point I was making, right? We have to keep buying it to drive its price down. It's the same as kind of, consumption at the margin of anything. You're not going to eat any more McDonald's unless you eat McDonald's every single day. You're not going to get sick of it. So it's the exact same thing. So anyway, now we can do questions.
Great. Thank you. I'll ask the first question. I think it's directed to Dr. Roy. It's our most upvoted one. As neoclassical economics paradigm ignores the radical uncertainty that exists in a function of the economy, and the private players are themselves, like they will not participate in the uncertainty of building these green projects. How should the response be in terms of policy in India? Should a big state intervention be part of the response?
No, I don't think that people don't make money out of uncertainty. In fact, most people only make money out of uncertainty. So I want to point out to you that this entire green transition is going to make a lot of money for some people. Nobody's going to lose any money. In fact, what they're trying to tell you is that if you don't invest in green, you lose money. So the default is if you invest in green, you'll make money. It's not changing capitalism. The transition to green is a profoundly capitalist project. And there I completely agree with Kanika. Therefore, if I was a green advocate, which I'm not, it's not my main business, then I like green for other reasons that which I'll come to in a minute in terms of what you're saying. So if you ask the larger question, I mean, again, I want to encourage you to think as economists, because you have to abstract. It's your job, right? It's our job as economists. I'm a policy guy, so I won't be bringing these abstractions to policy. But we must be very clear that we are lacking that challenge framework, which we have to work on to be able to address this main issue, which I'm bringing to your attention. Green transitions, if successful, will make a lot of money for capitalists in exactly the same proportion as capitalists exist today. So you're not going to get any equity out of green transition except at the margin charitably, right? If that is the case, then what do I do? So I ask then, this is what I do in policy, that if I have to address this situation within the confines of where we are, then I will say two things. One is we should take it as a parameter that there's no uncertainty around the fact that carbon emissions will cause grief. Right? Now notice how cleverly, whenever we talk about uncertainty, the only argument used is insurance. Nobody's forcing anybody to buy insurance. My farmer in Orissa doesn't have insurance today. So kal kuch ho jayega, he won't have insurance. No worse off, Pareto. No worse off. So why should I enter that racket at all? Right? But if you're saying that that will actually cause a loss of production and we do the cost benefit and we say we don't want that, then I think what I would call precautionary green makes sense. But I think in India, there's very limited scope for that. Because my people are not already subject to huge amounts of uncertainty and loss of income and vulnerability. You know as well as I do that for every 4 people that exit poverty in a given year, every 10 people, beg your pardon, 4 enter poverty, right? And that's true of about 70% of our population. So we're talking in a high uncertainty environment. So the returns to uncertainty for me are not the same as for Sweden. But there are other returns to green, which is why I support green. So nothing to do with what we have talked about so far. And I always like to get away from therefore these death tales, because they're basically how capitalists make money. I don't mind them making money, but I need them to know that I'm watching. But I'm not a communist. I like capitalists to make money, but they should know I'm watching. I mean, you make money, but you know, I'm also a social democrat. I will alter relative prices, and you better know that I know that you're making money. You're not doing this for the common planet. So, what is the big deal? The big deal in India is that India is a profoundly unproductive economy, and where essentially our patterns of production and consumption are profoundly unequalizing, however you look at it. Whether you look at it regionally, millions of people migrating from UP to Maharashtra and Gujarat, and a profound unwillingness to locate industry and economic activity where they are. The profound inequity of agriculture, it's lying out before you. They're so scared of farmers, they want to, you know, throw water cannons at them. I wonder how much the water cannon people made by selling those water cannons. It's always business in all this. But if you, my alliance with the green people is very limited, because as I tell them very provocatively, I don't care about the environment, and this is exactly the question, is you will find that if you make a green intervention, paradoxically, because there's so much Western R&D in it, and there's so much, you know, sort of effort made to make it make money, it tends to be more productive than a non-green decision. So today, if you go green with your energy mix, your energy productivity goes up. And when productivity goes up, it is good for everybody, because then you use fewer resources to make more things, which is basic economics, right? So I have done a very careful scan of many green things, other than this vegetarian nonsense and other such outliers. Most things that people say, whether it is zero-based farming, whether it is you know, renewable energy, whether it is mining and how to do better mining and how to use natural resources, that fits with the general paradigm that all economists, irrespective of ideology, have or analytical framework have, which is that resources are scarce. That's what defines our subject. Because resources are scarce, you should use them wisely, and you should use them in a limited way. And that is why I don't like people saying that, you know, renewable energy should be used to sort of maintain consumption. No. It's also scarce, and we need to attach a scarcity value to it. If you do that, you get a more productive economy, and that is what we need in India. India has to emerge as an economy that is transformed by making ordinary things cheaper for people to produce and consume. What we have, whether it's the green revolution or our coal infrastructure or our railways or any of these things that these green people want us to do less of, these things have contributed to making things very expensive for some people and cheap for others. The green revolution has made cheap food for me, but not for the person 25 kilometers from the farm. Zero budget natural farming will help change that. And if that is green, that is good. So for me, green signals efficiency and productivity. And therefore, this will surprise you after all I've said. I actually support the endeavor entirely for that reason and will argue for it, but under no illusion that this is about making money. Green can be equitable if we take this lens, and that is where I think as economists, we must focus on the productivity and efficiency that going green brings for a country that has not entirely committed its energy transformation into giant fossil fuels yet. So we are at a place where we have these pathway choices, and we should grab them with both hands and use all those Nordic children's efficiency R&D investment to in our country to make things more efficient. That's my extremely parochial view on the uncertainty question and the green question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. Our next question is for Kanika. There's an attendee, anonymous attendee. He is asking, how can economics and policy not get a balanced approach? Is it merely one versus the other, or are the external factors that hamper this balancing act?
So that's a really interesting question, but I don't know honestly how can anyone imagine that it would be one versus the other? Because I mean, what is policy supposed to be doing? Right? It's supposed to be doing things that kind of make sense. And it is not that only economics makes sense. But economics does make some sense. So you can't kind of disregard it out of hand. Say, for instance, let me give you an example. A lot of people who've been working on India's energy transition have often asked that, we've made very large strides forward in the renewable space, but not as much in the electric vehicle space, even though the government has paid attention to both. But why have they followed a different approach? Whereas on renewables, they've set very clear targets. There's, policy, regulation, everything that is keeping pace with that overall ambition. On mobility, there is some half-hearted target setting for 2030. There was even some announcement in the budget speech in the pre-COVID budget around some, discounts on loan repayment, etc., which are all good inducements. But there's never that clear pathway. And that's because of economics. And we just think that, the economics of the mobility market is not changing because the policy has not, driven it. But that's because we've kept our blinders on and looked only at the economics of the mobility market. If you look at the economics of India, that is why the government has not done it. Because 3% of GDP equivalent is the government's collection from tax on petrochem. The government does not want to lose that revenue in a general, tax shortfall kind of economy. So it is actually, in fact, economics that has driven the lack of policy in that space, right? Of course, the transparency and this kind of articulation of the reason on my part is mere speculation, because the government never actually tells you what they're doing or why they're doing it. But that aside, it is important to kind of think of economics as outside of our, little blinders on view. That is one thing. The second thing is also, when policy fails or when policy results in market failure or whatever else, it is for the same reason that we are optimizing for something without necessarily balancing other things. But that is all actually a part of economics. So actually, I would say the failure in policy making is not because of economics, but it's because of the process of policy making being kind of disaggregated. So for instance, even in renewables, we have this national obsession with the lowest cost of one electron. And who will deliver that cheapest electron? Will it be solar? Will it be wind? Or will it be thermal? But we don't think of economy-wide cost. A cheap electron in, say, Tamil Nadu, where there is a lot of electrons going into the wires already, versus a slightly more expensive electron in Jharkhand, where the wires are not congested, actually at an economy-wide level, that one is better. Similarly, in job creation, renewable and rooftop jobs, rooftop solar creates 8 times as many jobs per megawatt as utility scale. But it is marginally more expensive. But at an economy-wide level, it may generate more economic value for your economy. So I think these are all economic trade-offs that policy must answer, but policy doesn't. So actually, I think that the balance is because we are not taking economics or a view of good economics holistically. We're kind of applying economic principles, but you're defining your box or your constraint as per your convenience. And so that is the flaw. It is not the flaw. I mean, there is not necessarily a tug of war between good policy and good economics, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Kanika. Last question is, okay, it's not last, but I have a question for Dulka. So you were talking about local participatory policy making and using local voices to come up with solutions, as well as asking them what the issues are. So I just always wondered, how would you do that on a global scale? That sounds like a very hard thing to do, even in India, like with these diverse and huge populations.
No, it is hard. It is hard. It is messy. It is very time consuming. We are trying to do it at a very small scale, at the city scale. We are trying to do a process of inclusive climate action planning, just making sure, just trying to have this, openness to this approach of consulting communities, in addition to the expert-driven, data-driven recommendations. It's very time consuming. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a simple answer to your question. The only thing I can say is there are many good examples over the last decade of doing sustainability science, of doing, of at least demonstrating these approaches. So the toolkits, the, who you should have in your workshop, all those guidelines are available for anybody who chooses to use this approach. One example we have is, my colleagues have done some work in a district in Madhya Pradesh called Sidhi, where we've identified what the potential is for restoring the land through various means. But they've also mapped out, for example, how seeds flow, how money flows, who are the different actors, and how well are they connected to the actors that make decisions. And we are now kind of going to go ahead and pilot this approach in that district and actually try to implement some of these interventions. So yeah, just a very short answer to your question is there are examples, there are sort of demos. It's not universal by any means. At the global scale that you talked about, we rely on our representatives, right? I mean, that's how the process has been so far, and it's not gotten us very far. So we clearly need an alternative, that too.
May I just comment on that for a minute? I think what Alka is saying is very important, Ulka, sorry. You see, one of the reasons this is so important is that just like education and health, in India, unlike in many other countries, green is technocratic. If you look at the balance of people who fund research on green, whether Kanika will vouch for this, it's all foreigners. Everybody is now worried about FCRA and what will happen to research. And that is because there is simply the early tradition of green we had from the Chipko movement and other things, where you actually had social movements that demanded green. Those have not been fostered. So I think going to the local level, but with a political lens, and getting social movements where people understand that going green gives them an opportunity for empowerment, and getting them to own it, I think is of the first importance. And, so in a sentence, I'd say you had India against corruption. Why don't you have India against pollution? That is our challenge.
Actually, just to maybe add very quickly on that, and Ulka said this as well, and Rathin, you talked about zero budget natural farming, and I think that those are important aspects. And one of the things that we try and think about also at CEW is how do you make climate action or the energy transition, whichever one you want to pick, because they're very deeply interlinked, a poll topic. Because the thing is, when farmers I mean, maybe not this time, but usually when farmers come and protest at Jantar Mantar, when there is, drought in Marathwada, when there is almost every, higher frequency of heat stress related deaths, new viruses whether it's for plants or for human beings, the frequency of natural disasters going up, being climate linked, all of that, the science is there. We just don't know how to communicate it. So people, and I always find this so interesting that India has no climate deniers, right? And that's fantastic. But we also don't have any climate champions because we think of it as removed from ourselves. If it is basic, Rathin says this jokingly, but it's not untrue. He said, I'm going to die. What do I care about climate change? But this is the point that if I don't, and this is, the life versus livelihoods debate that we had in the context of the pandemic. It's the same thing. It's like, yes, okay, it would be good to have clean air. But at the moment, and we saw this in the pandemic, that emission, like factory emissions and just pictures of that was a sign of life returning and livelihoods returning. And I think that that's the problem. It's because we haven't necessarily effectively communicated the economic value of climate action. In a way that is, you are better off, in a way that is Pareto enhancing. And there is, and this is like through jobs and cooperatives and ownership structures and so many different things.
Yeah. We are nearing the end of our time. So I would like our panelists, if they have any closing comments, we would love to have some closing things, that food for thought that we could take back. Maybe start with Rathin.
I think again for the economists, work on that alternative paradigm and keep it there as a benchmark. Do not let people tell you that the only way we'll do it is through market. Understand that this is being driven, the whole green business is driven by lots of people wanting to make money as usual. Therefore, economists have a responsibility to point out the consequences of that, as I've tried to do today. So if you're going to rethink economics, then we're going to have to present good analytical research that presents a different way of seeing the problem. Then don't forget political economy. I think the latter part of the discussion showed that. So in a sentence, if we can show that patterns of production and consumption changing as a consequence of addressing climate change are good in terms of redistribution or empowerment, which is good for economic progress and productive inclusion, then that is where we can ally with the green people, and that is where we can ally with the Sweden people. But we have to do it on our own terms. So we have a responsibility to bring out our own model that shows why we want to go green. And I'm afraid the common planet argument doesn't take me far enough.
Thank you. Kanika, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think broadly, just to kind of keep the same thing around policy implications of this is, I think that we should be cautious to reject false binaries. It's not good policy versus good economics. It's not growth versus sustainability. While Rathin was at NIPFP, we did a joint study in about green recovery on how to balance jobs, growth, and sustainability. So actually, and that is not it. It's not like, oh, it sounds too good to be true. There are really, like Ulka was saying, in plain sight opportunities for us to build on in a very real way. So while I would endorse Rathin's idea of be the watchdog, think about new economic paradigms, definitely do that, but also in a very real way. Vote with your wallet, or like vote with your feet, right? So make sure you choose the right representatives, make sure you choose the right products, consume carefully or cautiously, and vegetarianism is not the panacea.
All right, Ulka.
Right. So my parting message is for economists to work with non-economists more. And one example that I'll give is, when I was doing the study in Jalna on drought, I was teamed up with a hydrologist. And when we entered the village, she immediately started just automatically noting down where every hand pump was located. And I started talking to the village tailor or the village shopkeeper to know if there had been an impact on their business because of the drought. So we just automatically, because of our disciplinary training and biases, we just see the world in different ways. We diagnose problems differently, and therefore we offer different solutions. So do break out of our echo chambers and work in interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today. If anything else, this has been a great push towards more pluralist thought. So that's something common between all of us. So we are closing, we have our closing event next weekend, where we will be discussing better economics for climate change from an industry perspective. So do join us for that. Register through the link in the chat. And as always, the session is recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Also, we have our Twitter, Instagram, Facebook page, and we also have a newsletter. So please sign up for that through our website. And you can also tag us on Twitter, follow the conversation on hashtag Better Economics for Climate Change. And also check out our partner project organization, the Pale Project, who are doing some great work. Thank you so much for joining, and see you all next weekend.